Okay, that was a great, we're kind of moved very smoothly from your comment to now gender. Um, so I will be talking a little bit about gender inequality. It is a passion of mine, um, because I lived in a country without gender equality. So, uh, I think, yeah, it's very close to my heart. And then, especially in the climate crisis, that's kind of at least not done by a dictator. So, climate crisis is not gender neutral. I think it's a good sentence to remember because nature doesn't discriminate against men and women, but society does. So it's good to remember when a hurricane happens or a flood happens, it's not that they're like, we're going to affect women more and we're going to spare the men. It's more of the society's norms are what causes the inequality. In developing countries, women, especially in Africa, as you said, are more affected by climate change because of their traditional roles, because of what role society has put on them. And this make them just more vulnerable to droughts, floods, and other stresses. Um, Women rely on climate sensitive livelihood, like small scale farming, or water, preparing water. One thing I learned is in a lot of these countries, women are not taught to swim. So when a flood happens, they can't swim to save their lives. Not voluntarily, they didn't learn to swim because of their roles and how busy they are with caring for the family. They just didn't have the chance to swim. This was a shocking fact to me, even though it's so simple. But when I think about it, when a crisis happens, they just can't swim out of the flood. So technically, their death rates are higher. In countries like Ethiopia, these kinds of vulnerabilities results in gender-specific consequences, and they end up shouldering more of the burden at home, while men are the ones that migrate and go to other parts to bring food, bring income, bring money, and like help the family survive. So women end up staying in that area that's more vulnerable to the climate crisis. Women's limited access to resources is a huge issue. As climate change is getting worse, there's competition for land, water, energy increases, and they're already in a disadvantaged part, and they now face more marginalization. So in the area that they have to stay in because they're caring for the elderly of the family, for the children, for everyone else, there's not enough for everybody. So they might get into violence, they might have food insecurity, and so on and so forth. Climate change also affects their health disproportionately. We know men and women's bodies are different. We are built different. We're made different. Issues like malnutrition, reproductive health complication, mental health stressors. The woman's brain functions differently than a man's brain. We know that. We've seen that with anyone who's had a brother, father, partner. It just works differently. And I think women preparing for the future and thinking about what they need to do, plus these stressors, it just affects them way more. Women and girls face heightened risk during migration and displacements as well. So once they are starting to get on the move, now they are also more vulnerable to the hazards along the way. Because there are no social protections specifically for women and increased threats like trafficking, which happens a lot from the Southern America to the United States, this also puts them in a more vulnerable state. Women who rely on agriculture and natural resources are disproportionately affected by climate-induced losses. If there's a farming happening and that's their main source of, they rely on that as a main source, their income, their livelihood is completely gone. The economic insecurity exacerbates gender inequality and it limits their independence. Contrary to their portrayal as victims, because we always talk about them being vulnerable, and it's not, I had to change my mindset too, because it's not that they're always just the victims. They are very active contributors to solutions if they are allowed to be. Examples are in Somalia and Rwanda, actually. Women's leadership in sustainability is driving climate adaptation, because they are experts in how to live sustainable. Now they're using their powers. I mean, we'll get back to you on that to see what you have heard, but they're using their powers to help lead. Several African countries are taking steps to ensure women's participation in climate actions are happening, and they're helping in natural resource management. I started learning about gender mainstreaming actually recently, even though this term has come up a long time ago, I think 1970s, 1980s. But gender mainstreaming is now being talked about more. I've been listening to some podcasts too, and it means not just including one or two things that are good for women, but actually including them in every part of the policy making or funding that they come up with for crisis management. For example, I looked up examples, and gender mainstreaming in a workplace would be to count for the budget for childcare, to count a budget for reproductive products, to count the budget for breastfeeding rooms. Like, those are things that are in gender mainstream. It's not just bringing women in, it's actually having them one part of the funding, budgeting, and policymaking. We talked about the Sustainable Development Goals. This was a very interesting thing from the UN Women, and gender equality is Sustainable Development Goal number 5, and it is in the center. It's kind of central for all the other ones to be achieved. Climate action, clean water sanitation, as you said, women are the ones in these areas that carry the water and get the clean water. Clean energy. They are also women have equal rights to the city, their safety. Most of the time, these women end up staying in the surrounding areas and don't go to the city. So these all come together to give us gender equality. Gender equality is not just seeing women, but it's including them in everything else. And because of their exclusion from decision-making processes, this has become a barrier. Most of the time we see men are deciding how everyone should be, and they see it from a man's perspective. It's not their fault, it's different. But if you add a woman to the leadership, they'll be like, no, we actually need to do this like this, because this is how women do it. And that by itself has made a huge difference in areas that they've been doing it. We think the path forward is to not only look at women as the victims, which I myself am guilty of doing that. I always thought they're vulnerable, they're victims, they need help, but look at them as more of they have more expertise because they're the ones doing the work in that region that's being affected. And support women in low carbon agriculture and clean energy sectors. I believe there are areas that women are now making a soil out of food waste for their farming, and they've been taught, they've been educated, and to confront structural inequalities that limit women's agency. I think at the end of the day, I always say this, that education it doesn't have to be in the form of academic education. It can be in form of just teaching them to do something professionally so that they can rely on it for their livelihood, for their agency, for their independence. And yeah, and while women bear the most of the climate change burden, they also offer crucial leadership in finding solutions, and policies that center gender equality will not only reduce these inequalities, but also will enhance our collective ability to address these changes and find better solutions. So I think it's time to include more women in decision-making in everywhere, because women are very crucial in these areas. One thing I did listen to the podcast about, I know I say a lot of stories about things, but it just makes a lot of sense. They were asking this climate expert on gender about, what do you say to women who are afraid of having children because of the climate crisis, and they don't want to have a child in this world that's going towards this? And her answer, I am one of those women who's scared of having a kid in this world. And her answer was actually very interesting. She said, I think I tell them to think of it. You are a person who's thinking about this climate crisis. If you don't have a child, if you have a child and teach them to think about it, you're not letting that climate crisis win. You're not letting them win. You are actually fighting against them with that because you're continuing your path. But if you give up on it and you say, no, I can't do it, even though respecting people who have their own reasons, but if you give up on it just because of that, it's kind of like you're losing the battle. And if that's your only thing, you should still continue fighting because that's the only thing we can do. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Thank you.